even more access to information. So he was very, very bright. At the end of the war, he continued his education at the City College of New York, finally came under scrutiny in 1948 after U.S. counterintelligence agents discovered a story about the Koval family in a Soviet publication. He eventually fled the country. In 2002, a book appeared in Russia called The GRU and the Atomic Bomb, which referenced a spy known only by a code name, Delmar. It was only in 2007 that Vladimir Putin posthumously recognized Koval as a hero of the Russian Federation and revealed that he was the infamous and unknown Delmar. So he maintained his silence and secrecy to the grave.
And I think he worked on the Manhattan Project, or he was at least in the periphery of that and bumped up the Soviet nuclear program by a few years. Do I have that right?
He certainly was involved in it. I have not seen the fact that he sped them ahead 2 years, but they were so effectively collecting on the Manhattan Project. One of the interesting things in counterintelligence you talk about is, well, the FBI talks about, is how effectively they stopped the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese from penetrating our key military defense programs, and certainly the Manhattan Project. And there was no hostile Axis penetration. The problem was we were thoroughly penetrated by our friends, and Russia at the time was a friend, and they thoroughly penetrated it. And where we anticipated ending the Cold War with at least a decade of advantage in which we would have had unilateral control of the atomic bomb, that certainly eroded very quickly. And within 4 years, Russia had tested an effective atomic weapon. So they operated very effectively and has to go down as one of the most effective espionage operations in our history, that they were able to penetrate Manhattan Project so effectively and pull from it the key bits of data, especially on the implosion technique being the most successful way to detonate the device. So Koval played an important role and managed to avoid scrutiny for so many years. So it was a very effective operation.
And if I just may add on that point, it picks up on a statement I made earlier that the business of intelligence collection requires multiple sources with multiple access if you're going to get a full picture. So the beauty from the standpoint of just looking at an espionage operation of what the Soviets did on the Manhattan Project is they didn't just concentrate on Columbia and in New York. They were at Los Alamos. They were at Oak Ridge. They were in Chicago. Any place where the Manhattan Project had some kind of activity, the Soviets seem to have been able to find or deploy agents to pick the information out of that particular location, and then they effectively put it together.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character, and I read somewhere about Koval that after he defected to the USSR, he taught at a university, but there were still parts of his American life that stayed with him to the end, where he would teach about nuclear physics, but then mispronounce words like thermocoupler in an English accent instead of a Russian, and students would snicker at him. But getting into the Cold War, there's one other character I'm very interested in about is a congressman who was actively involved in the House Un-American Activities Committee, who himself was a spy. So how does this all come about, the story of Samuel Dixon?
Well, Samuel Dixon is one of our favorites. His NKVD assigned codename Crook should tell you all you need to know about what they thought of him as well. And he was a New York congressman and was actively involved in providing information. He was always wanting more money for the Soviets, and they thought that was an effective title for him. In the book, we were surprised to find how many roads in a little square in Washington, in New York City, are still named in his honor, as if he has any honor left. But it's amazing that we had congressmen that were operating as active Soviet agents.
I think it is not surprising, though, that the Soviets early on would focus on Congress and that part of the United States government as possible places for penetration. Likely that has become even more the case in recent years as the whole process of congressional oversight has enabled congressional staff and congressional members to have greater and greater insight into specific intelligence operations. That is not a statement to be critical of the oversight process. It's a statement just to emphasize that when intelligence operations look at potential, where potential sources might be, the first question they ask is, what is the access? And if someone or some people in an institution have access to the classified, to the sensitive information, they are going to go after it. If I may just step back, though, to the start of the Congressman Dixon's spying, the House Committee on Un-American Activities was initially set up to go after Nazis. And that was the focus on the original discussions and the original formation of the committee that goes back to 1934. And it was only subsequently, primarily in the 1940s, that the committee changed its focus more to the Soviet and to the communist threat.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. That leads into another issue, and I want to take a step back and look more generally at Spycraft and discuss what do most people misunderstand about spies and their work. For example, with Samuel Dixon, I don't know if he was recruited by the Soviets while he was a politician, or some might guess he was a Manchurian candidate that was groomed for this type of thing. I think when people see spycraft in fiction like James Bond, most people know that that's a ridiculous exaggeration and there's very little that's realistic about him. But now it seems like when people talk about spycraft, everyone is assuming a Manchurian candidate. That, Russia in 2016 and 2020, they had sleeper cells. They have politicians they've groomed for decades to destabilize our democracy. So it's almost taken for granted that there's Manchurian candidates everywhere. Is a Manchurian candidate something that's realistic? And what are other things that people misunderstand about spies and their work?
I'll take a first stab at it. I believe the Samuel Condon novel, that the Manchurian Candidate, was a sensation at the time, and it came after, at a point in the 1950s, that we believed it was possible. The Soviets believed, and the U.S. believed it was possible to create pharmacological spies. It turned out to not be dependable, not be accurate, but it spawned popular opinion that was true. That led to U.S. operations in MK Ultra, where we attempted to create many of those same programs, but mostly ineffective. However, if you're going to be a spy, you clearly have to have defined objectives, and those objectives have to be there for a purpose and a reason. You need to provide them back. In the case of Congressman Dixon, he was making $1,250 a month extra income, which was a significant sum at the time, and providing information to his handlers on fascists, German agents, white Russians. He was in a position to pass along very, very important information. So it continues to be successful. He was an unusual point. What's kind of strange is that he was later a New York Supreme Court judge, but it was only until the 1990s that information on his true political leanings and the betrayal of the country came out. So it was interesting that history kept it hidden so long.
I think that one of the important misunderstandings of spies is the failure to make the distinction between an intelligence officer and a spy. In my career at the CIA, I was an intelligence officer. I was not a spy. Someone like Robert Hansen, or from the FBI, an FBI special agent, or Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer, they were both intelligence officers working for their country, working for the United States, and they were spies, that is, providing clandestine reporting to their spy handlers, to their, if you will, intelligence officers who happen to be Soviets, who were Soviets. So in most cases, when we talk about an individual, it's useful to make that distinction as to whether the individual is an officer, an intelligence officer handling spies, or the individual is the spy who has the direct access to the sensitive classified information and is providing that unauthorized to the foreign power. I think that is a distinction that would clarify a lot of misunderstandings if made more carefully.
Right, that is a very good point to make too, since these can all get mixed together. Earlier in the episode, you had mentioned that there are factors of spycraft that are consistent across history. If we're talking the era of Sun Tzu 2,000 years ago versus today. In terms of motivations of those who become spies, do you see that they largely have the same motivations they did in the past, whether money, power, sex, whatever? Or do you see ways that the motives or psychology has changed over the years?
I would offer to you the popular acronym where we list four motivations: money, ideology, compromise or blackmail, and ego. And you can always think of these under the acronym MICE, M-I-C-E. If you add to those failed marriages, failed careers, jealous coworkers, substance abuse, family problems, and as one of our friends, Dr. David Charney, who's a psychiatrist known as the kind of the psychiatrist of the spies, since he tends to work with many of them after they've caught. He has a theory that says a person becomes a spy when they wake up in the morning and the person they look at in the mirror is an abject failure in life and is so disillusioned. If they have access to secrets and they can convert that to some monetary gain, it is a temporary feel-good that offsets the ongoing pain they're living in their life. They are, however, unrealizing that ultimately the cumulative effect of betraying your country will bring far greater problems than ever before. And so people that betray their country, the great lesson we learned in the Cold War was that loyal Americans would betray their country for money. And this is something we had never really thought of during, for example, World War II. But in the Cold War, it became clear that the majority of the spies that did the greatest damage did it for financial gain. If you look at the the Aldrich Ames, you look at the